My name is Captain James Jimmy Morrison, and I never imagined that my last combat flight would also be the day I learned the true meaning of honor. It was December 1944, and I was piloting my B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Memphis Belle II, over the frozen skies of Germany. The cold cut to the bone, even inside the heated cockpit, and each breath formed a small cloud of vapor in front of my face. We had just completed our bombing mission over a munitions factory near Bremen when everything started going wrong. The sky was covered with heavy gray clouds, promising snow at any moment. I could hear my crew's heavy breathing through the intercom, 9 men whose lives depended on my decisions. "Commander, we've got 2 Messerschmitts at 6 o'clock. My tail gunner's voice, Sergeant Tommy O'Brien, echoed in my ears with urgency. My heart immediately accelerated. Tommy was a kid from Boston, only 20 years old, who dreamed of going home to work at his father's bakery. I maneuvered the heavy bomber with all the skill that 3 years of war had given me. The B-17 wasn't exactly agile. It was like trying to waltz with an elephant, but I knew every inch of that machine. Tracer bullets cut through the air around us, illuminating the gray sky with deadly lines of orange fire. "Hold tight, boys!" I shouted as I dove sharply to the left. The roar of the engines mixed with the sound of 50 caliber machine guns firing from all positions of the aircraft. The smell of gunpowder and engine oil filled the air. That's when I felt the impact. A violent tremor ran through the entire structure of the plane, and engine number 3 began spewing thick black smoke. Through the rearview mirror, I saw a tongue of orange and red flames licking the right wing. "Engine 3 on fire!" shouted my co-pilot, Lieutenant Dave Patterson. Dave was from North Carolina, a calm man who always kept his composure even in the worst situations. But at that moment, even his voice revealed tension. "We need to put it out, Jimmy." My fingers flew over the controls, cutting fuel to the burning engine and activating the extinguishing system. For an interminable moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the flames diminished until they completely went out. But we still had smoke, and the engine was completely dead. "Everyone's status?" I asked through the intercom, trying to keep my voice steady. The responses came one after another. Staff Sergeant Mike "Smokey" Williams, our flight engineer, reported structural damage to the wing. Technical Sergeant Robert Hayes, the navigator from Long Island, informed that we were about 300 miles from the base in England. The radio operator, Sergeant Johnny Martinez, a young man from Texas who always carried a photo of his girlfriend in his pocket, said the radio was partially functioning, but the worst news came from the belly gunner, Sergeant Paul Kowalski. "Commander, Sergeant Miller's been hit." My heart sank. Chris Miller was our upper turret gunner, a guy from Chicago who made the best jokes to keep morale high. "How bad?" I asked, though I feared the answer. "He's bleeding a lot, sir. We're trying to stop it, but he needs a doctor and fast." I looked at the instrument panel. We had lost an engine, the fuselage was damaged, a man seriously wounded, and we were still in enemy territory. Fuel was dropping faster than it should. There was probably a leak somewhere. I did the mental calculations and came to the conclusion I didn't want to accept. We wouldn't make it to England. "Dave," I said to my co-pilot, "we're not going to make it." He looked at me with those piercing blue eyes, and I saw he had already reached the same conclusion. "What do you want to do?" Through the clouds ahead of me, I saw an opening. Below, the snow-covered fields of Germany stretched like an endless white blanket. It was starting to snow lightly, small flakes that stuck to the windshield. "We're going to look for a place to make an emergency landing," I decided. "We need to save Miller." That's when I saw them again. Not 2, but 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, emerging from the clouds like hungry sharks. Their grey fuselages stood out against the sky, and I could see the German markings clearly painted on the wings. My stomach tightened. With only 3 engines and carrying a wounded man, we had no chance of escaping or fighting properly. The German fighters approached in formation, and I mentally prepared my crew for the inevitable. I closed my eyes for a brief second, thinking of my wife, Sarah, waiting for me in Nebraska, with our 3-year-old daughter, Emily, whom I barely knew. Would this be the last time I saw the sky? But the shots didn't come. I opened my eyes and saw something I would never forget. The leader of the Messerschmitts, with the number 13 painted on the fuselage, flew until he was parallel to my left wing, so close that I could see the pilot through the cockpit. He was looking directly at me. It wasn't a look of hatred or aggression. It was something different. The German pilot, wearing his leather helmet and aviator goggles, observed our condition. The smoking engine, the bullet holes in the fuselage, the broken glass in the gunner's turret. He saw that we were a destroyed bomber, desperately trying to get back home. "Dave, are you seeing this?" I murmured, barely believing it. "I'm seeing it, but I'm not believing it," he replied, equally astonished. The German pilot made a hand signal, a gesture that in any combat context wouldn't make sense. He pointed downward, then made a circular motion with his finger. Was he telling us to land, or was it a trap? Our gazes met for a long moment through the glass in the distance. I could see he was young, maybe my age, around 25 years old. And in that instant, something passed between us. A silent understanding between two men who knew the horror of war, two pilots who loved flying but hated killing. "Commander, what's he doing?" Tommy asked through the intercom, his voice full of confusion and fear. "I'm not sure," I answered honestly. The German pilot then did something even more surprising. He brought his hand to his forehead in a perfect military salute, a salute of respect, of recognition, from one warrior to another. Without thinking automatically, I raised my hand and returned the salute. It was an absurd moment in the middle of that brutal war, two enemies greeting each other like gentlemen in an honor duel, not like killers in an industrial killing machine. The German pilot then waved to his companions, and to my complete amazement, the four fighters positioned themselves around my B-17, one on each wing, one behind, and the leader in front. They were escorting us. "What the hell is happening?" Dave asked, his voice revealing the disbelief we all felt. For the next 40 minutes, those German pilots guided us through hostile territory. When we spotted German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground, the leader rocked his wings, a recognition signal that prevented them from shooting at us. We crossed the front line, that nebulous zone where Germans and Allies faced each other daily, and the Messerschmitts remained at our side. Deep in the back of the aircraft, Paul and Johnny worked frantically to save Chris Miller. "How is he?" I asked through the intercom, trying not to let desperation show in my voice. "Stable for now, Commander," Paul replied, though his voice didn't sound very confident. "But he needs surgery. I don't know how much longer he can hold on." I looked at the fuel gauge. The needles kept falling inexorably. Even with the German escort, we wouldn't make it to England. We needed to find a place to land, and fast. That's when I spotted through the increasingly dense snow an open field in the Netherlands, just beyond the Allied front line. It wasn't ideal, but it was our only chance. The German pilot, who had been observing our movements attentively, seemed to understand immediately. He pointed to the field and nodded positively. Then he made another gesture. He would take us there and then leave. I began the descent. Each meter a challenge with only 3 engines and damaged controls. The B-17 vibrated and protested, but responded to commands. Dave was at my side, helping to control the weight of the heavy bomber as we lost altitude. "Crew, prepare for emergency landing," I announced. "Fasten your belts and hold tight, it's going to be rough." The snowy fields of the Netherlands approached rapidly. I could see small farmhouses, snow-covered barns, and on the horizon a small village with its pointed church tower. It was an almost peaceful scene, in brutal contrast to the war devastating the continent. At 200 feet altitude, I lowered the landing gear. There was a terrible screech of metal against metal, and only 2 of the 3 wheels came down completely. The nose wheel was stuck. "Damn," I muttered. "Dave, we've got a problem." "I see it," he replied, his jaw tense. "We're going to have to land without it." 150 feet. The field was covered with fresh snow, which could cushion the impact, but also hid dangers, stones, ditches, anything that could completely destroy our already damaged plane. The Messerschmitts began to move away. The leader, that mysterious pilot who had spared us, flew one last time alongside my window. Again, our gazes met. This time I saw something in his eyes. Hope that we would survive. Hope that perhaps this insane war would end one day. I raised my hand one last time. He returned the gesture, then pulled the stick and climbed, his aircraft disappearing into the low clouds along with his companions. And just as they appeared, they vanished. 50 feet. I could clearly see the terrain now. It wasn't totally flat. There were some undulations, but it would have to do. "Hold on tight," I shouted into the intercom. 20 feet. 10, 5. The impact was violent. The rear wheels touched first, raising a cloud of snow. Then the nose fell heavily, the fuselage scraping on the frozen ground with a horrifying sound of metal being torn. I was thrown forward against the seatbelt with brutal force, the air being expelled from my lungs. The B-17 slid through the snow like a giant uncontrolled sled, spinning slightly to the right. I fought with the controls, trying to maintain some direction, but it was like trying to steer a mountain. Objects flew inside the cabin, maps, tools, everything that wasn't secured. The noise was deafening, screeching metal, screaming engines, screaming men. We crossed the field for an interminable 300 meters before finally stopping. For a moment, there was only silence except for the sound of the dying engines and the tick-tock of hot metal cooling rapidly in the cold air. "Everyone okay?" My voice came out hoarse. "Report." One by one, the crew members responded. Some minor injuries, cuts, bruises, a possibly broken wrist, but all alive. All except Chris, who was unconscious but still breathing. "Get out. Everyone out now," I ordered. There was always the risk of fire after a landing like this, and with damaged fuel tanks, we couldn't risk it. I opened the cockpit hatch and the cold Dutch air hit me like a punch. It was significantly colder than inside the heated aircraft. The snow had stopped momentarily, but the sky remained threatening and grey. I descended down the side of the fuselage, my legs trembling from adrenaline. When my feet touched the snowy ground, I felt a deep gratitude simply for being alive, for being on solid ground. The crew began to exit, some helping each other. Paul and Johnny carefully carried Chris Miller on an improvised stretcher. His face was as pale as the surrounding snow, and his uniform was stained with blood. Each breath formed small clouds of vapor in the cold air. "We need to get medical help for him," Paul said, his voice laden with urgency. "And fast." I looked around. We were in the middle of nowhere. White fields stretching in all directions, some bare trees marking property boundaries. The small village I had seen was about 2 kilometers away, its church still visible against the horizon. That's when I heard the sound of an engine. It wasn't a plane, it was a ground vehicle engine. Instinctively, I put my hand on my service pistol. We didn't know if we were in territory controlled by the Germans or the Allies. That area was in constant dispute. An old truck appeared on the nearby dirt road, stopping abruptly when the driver saw us. It was an older man, about 60 years old, wearing a thick coat and a wool cap. He got out of the truck slowly, his hands visible, showing he wasn't armed. "American!" he shouted in English, heavy with Dutch accent. "Yes, yes, American!" I shouted back, feeling a wave of relief. He ran toward us, his face showing concern. "You can't stay here. The Germans patrol this area. You have to come with me, quick." "We have a seriously wounded man," I said, pointing to Chris. The Dutchman looked at the destroyed bomber, then at us, and nodded firmly. "My name is Henrik. There's a British medical post 5 kilometers from here. We can take him there, but we have to go now." There was no time for questions. With Henrik's help and his extraordinary courage, we loaded Chris into the back of the truck. The rest of the crew squeezed in as best they could. As the truck began to move, I looked back at the Memphis Belle II. The aircraft was buried in the snow, smoke still rising from the damaged engine, the fuselage marked by bullet holes and the brutal landing. She had brought us home. Well, almost home. She had fulfilled her mission until the last moment. The British medical post was a converted farmhouse with the Red Cross flag hanging outside. Doctors and nurses ran to receive us as soon as we arrived. Chris Miller was immediately taken into surgery, while the rest of us received treatment for minor injuries. I was sitting outside despite the biting cold, unable to go inside. My mind kept returning to that moment in the sky, the German pilot, the salute, the escort. It didn't make sense. In that brutal war, where thousands died daily, where entire cities were reduced to rubble, where humanity seemed to have been forgotten, that man had chosen compassion. Dave joined me, bringing 2 cups of hot tea. I accepted gratefully, the warmth of the porcelain heating my frozen hands. "You saved our lives today, Jimmy," he said softly. "That landing, few pilots could do that." I shook my head. It wasn't me. It was that German pilot. If he had shot us down when he had the chance. I left the sentence unfinished. "Why do you think he did it?" I thought for a long moment before answering. "Because he saw what I saw. Not enemies, but men, pilots, people with families waiting at home. He saw that we were already defeated, and there was no honor in killing us when we couldn't fight anymore." Weeks later, after my crew had been repatriated to England and I had done the complete debriefing, I tried to investigate who that pilot had been. Intelligence records had no conclusive information. There were several German units operating in that area that day. Chris Miller survived the surgery and eventually went home to Chicago, where he lived until he was 80. He got married, had 3 children, and always told the story of the day an enemy pilot saved him. I returned to Nebraska after the war ended in 1945. I embraced my Sarah and truly met my daughter Emily. I never flew in combat again, though I continued flying civilian aircraft. Every time I went up into the skies, I thought about that day. For decades, the story remained with me as a vivid but private memory, until in 1987, I received a letter. It was from a German historian who was researching acts of chivalry during World War II. He had discovered records of a pilot named Oberleutnant Franz Steigler, who had reported an unusual encounter with a damaged Allied bomber in December 1944. My heart raced as I read. Attached to the letter was an address in Vancouver, Canada. Franz Steigler had immigrated to Canada after the war. With trembling hands, I wrote a letter. I described that day in detail: the burning engine, the salute, the escort. I asked, "Was it you?" 3 weeks later, I received a response. The handwriting was careful, the English excellent, but with touches of German accent even in writing. "Captain Morrison," the letter began. "Yes, it was me. I thought of you often over the years, wondering if you had survived the landing. I am grateful to know you did." Franz explained his decision that day. He had seen our destroyed bomber and thought of his own brother, a Luftwaffe pilot who'd been killed the previous year. He thought about how someone might have given his brother a chance if he had been in a similar situation. And he realized he had crossed the limits he had promised himself never to cross. He was still a soldier, but refused to be an assassin. "I had sworn," he wrote, "that I would never shoot a man in a parachute or in a plane that clearly couldn't defend itself. You and your men were already defeated that day. Shooting you down wouldn't be a victory. It would just be senseless death. And there was already too much death." We became friends through letters, and in 1990 we finally met in person at a veterans reunion in Washington, D.C. When we saw each other, now two gray-haired men in their 70s, we embraced like brothers. There was no need for words. Decades of gratitude, respect, and understanding passed between us in that embrace. "You saved 9 lives that day," I told him, tears in my eyes. "No," he replied, also emotional. "We saved them. You landed them safely. I just gave you the chance." In the following years, Franz and I traveled together, speaking at schools and museums about our encounter. We told our story not as simplistic anti-war propaganda, but as a testament that even in the darkest moments, humanity can prevail. That honor isn't an empty word, but a choice we make, especially when no one is watching, when it would be easier to do the opposite. Franz passed away in 2008. At 92 years old, I was at his bedside, holding his hand. His last words to me were, "It wasn't about war, Jimmy. It never was. It was about remembering we were human." Now, at 95 years old, sitting in my office in Omaha, surrounded by photographs, my family, my crew, and yes, a photo of Franz and me at our 1990 meeting, I reflect on that cold December day in 1944. That salute in the sky wasn't just a gesture. It was a recognition that despite everything, all the flags, ideologies, and orders, we were two men who loved flying, who respected the craft of aviation, and who understood the terrible cost of war. In that frozen moment in time, suspended between clouds and earth, between life and death, we chose to see each other not as enemies but as equals. War made us adversaries, but humanity kept us men. My last mission was also my most important, not because we bombed a target or won a battle, but because I learned that true courage isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when not to fight, about choosing mercy when revenge would be easier, about saving a life when it would be simpler to take one. Franz taught me that honor isn't a word we use to glorify war. It's the line that keeps us human when everything around us pushes us toward barbarism. And when I finally take my last flight, I know he'll be there waiting on the other side of the clouds, ready to escort me home one more time. And this time, there will be no war between us. Just two pilots, two friends, two men who understood that some things are greater than the flags we carry. Some things, like compassion, honor, and humanity, transcend even war.